Welcome to the SIWIKE Podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE Podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here again with Nora, who comes from us with a big background in HR. And today we thought we'd tackle the interesting conversation of diversity and inclusion. So it's one that's been a hot topic in the news lately, and for various reasons. And I know a little bit about it, but probably not nearly enough as much as I should. So I thought it'd be great to have a conversation with Nora just to get myself a little bit smarter, because I probably need to know a little bit more on this topic. So I'd love if you can start a bit on maybe like what it is and maybe how you got involved, and start on that side.
Sure. D&I, it's simply put, obviously diversity and inclusion. And the way I think about it, it's ensuring that, an organization, and whether that be a company, a school, a group or non-for-profit, has diverse representation in the area in which it operates in. And inclusion is making sure that every single person feels like they can bring themselves, their true selves and authentic selves to the place that they're working in or studying in. And that's kind of how I think about diversity and inclusion. So diversity is having different representation, and inclusion is making sure everybody has the tools and there's an environment for people to flourish, feel comfortable and feel accepted. And how I personally got involved in it happened almost, actually could go back to my days in university. While I was doing case studies, I had picked a D&I topic, and that was, what sparked my interest back in the day. But only recently in my current role did I get the opportunity to work into it in D&I. And I got the opportunity to join an ERG, an employee ERG, which was Edge East. So at Enbridge, it's ethically diverse employee. It's an ethically diverse employee resource group. It's just a little bit of a mouthful to say. So I've gotten involved over the past couple of years, and through my work, I've gotten the opportunity this year to actually be the co-chair of that, and lead a lot of D&I initiatives. And also because I'm in HR, and because we also essentially as a function own D&I and the policies and the programs, I've gotten an opportunity to work closely with our D&I team because of that. And as of recently, I'm also on another D&I steering committee at my organization. So it's almost like that one volunteering opportunity that I went into not really knowing what it was, over the past few years has kind of like really grown, and it's become a huge part of my role, and a big part of my week on an ongoing basis.
That's awesome. So if you look back to some of the things that you've kind of contribute to from an ERG and employee resource group perspective, like what are some of the things that like an ERG does, and what are some of the things that if folks maybe are in a smaller company where they don't necessarily have the size and scale to do some of the stuff like that, what could they kind of start doing in their workplace to kind of promote diversity and inclusion?
As a start, an ERG is a great place for individuals that are looking to connect with people that have shared experiences or shared interests also, to form an employee resource group. So it's an employee grass-led initiative. Usually it has to be sponsored by an executive. So if somebody's interested in starting something like that, I'd recommend that they reach out to either one of the senior leaders in the organization that has maybe talked about a topic like D&I that they're interested in, or just talk to their manager and see if they'd sponsor it. And it allows employees, especially in a large organization, come together from a lot of different functions because of that shared interest. And you get to network, and you get exposure to different people, like I said, across the organization at different levels as well. So it's great for career development. And in regards to D&I, where you could really start, and where Edge or our resource group has had an impact is, first, providing people with a safe space to talk about it, because D&I can be a difficult topic to discuss, whether you recognize as a visible minority or you are an ally and you're coming from a place of learning. So it provides a safe space for people to connect, to talk, to learn. But as employee resource groups become bigger, their influence increases, right? And that's where, as a resource group, if you've gotten big enough, you can actually start to influence culture. You can influence change. You can roll out large initiatives or large events that support your cause, or you might even be seen as a subject matter expert to other groups in the organization. So, for example, D&I will frequently reach out to resource groups like ours to help them facilitate equity focus groups, or to help them facilitate storytelling sessions or various events throughout the year.
Cool. And if you can talk a little bit about like the variety of, I guess, ERGs and different groups, because it's not just
No,
based
it's
on
not.
how you look and things like that. There's a whole bunch of other ones. So what are some of the examples of the more like interesting ones that might be less common that folks might want to consider including as part of their D&I initiatives?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different resource groups, right? There's women and like there's gender resource groups. There's recently in my organization, there's a resource group specifically for people with disabilities.
Mhm.
In my organization down in the States, there's a resource group especially for African Americans and Black employees. So there's so many different resource groups that you can have. There's even a resource group just for allies, specifically male allies to POCs, people of color or underrepresented groups. So there's so many different areas that you can go. My suggestion really is, if you don't already have like a basic D&I employee underrepresented employee resource group, that maybe that's a good starting point. And later on, when you get more established, or when you feel that there's like a need or an interest for somebody to start something, they can branch out. But if you don't already have that, that's where I'd really recommend you start.
Awesome. So for folks that are considering these and well, they've heard about that, why is it important to them, and what are some of the benefits they can hope to garner in setting up some of these like D&I initiatives?
Yeah, so from a like what the benefit is from an employee resource group, it's a lot, right? Like, you benefit if you're trying to roll out a D&I strategy in your organization, and you want people to get excited and be on board. Like, one of the tools that you can leverage is that employee resource group, because it almost empowers employees to get involved and shape the strategy, or shape the delivery more so, actually, in their own way. And it also provides that alignment, right? So that if you have a strategy, you're making sure that there's no broken telephone, that it's being delivered and it's being rolled out successfully, and it contributes to culture change, right? Because it's really the employees that are rolling it out, so it's the employees that are buying in. So that's a huge benefit I see. Another big benefit is, just as a person joining a resource group, the networking opportunities, the career development opportunities, right? Like, if you are in specifically a D&I resource group, and you are given the opportunity to, let's say, present a D&I discussion or panel, usually the people involved in that are at senior people leader levels, right? So you just get that organic opportunity to network, meet, and get exposure to people leaders throughout the organization. And you're also seen as an informal leader, because you're taking on leadership responsibilities that might not particularly be in your role. And you're also leading the way to improvement, because a lot of large organizations, Luki, these days have representation goals, right? And this work supports that. So those are just some of the, I'd like to say, many benefits that I think come from having a D&I resource group and getting involved in one.
That's awesome. So what I heard there was oftentimes, well, you start with the grassroots, so and you kind of bring some of these benefits to your leaders to say, hey, I feel part of an underrepresented group, whatever that is, maybe from a gender, diversity, cultural, or ethnicity, or whatever it is, and you start by probably taking a look at other folks in the group and saying there are and kind of rallying them together, or saying that there's not enough of us to be represented. And then you mentioned the importance of having a sponsor on that. So talk a little bit about going and maybe having that conversation with someone to get some of this stuff started.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't already have that group in your company, let's say your company's a little bit smaller,
Mhm.
having a sponsor really helps, get any kind of funding. If you want to roll out an event or an initiative, or if you need support, for example, for video editing, something we've done is we've launched a lot of videos of employee interviews because of COVID, right? So that's that support, the credibility as well of your group. You have a senior leader to push things forward for you and help that if you need to get connected to somebody in the organization, or if you need to announce on your company's social media platform an event or a social media post. Having that senior leader with you on that table, and having that senior leader's voice will really help build that credibility and that interest. And it is also about policy, right? Like some companies, you can't really start an official organization or group in the company without that support and without that sponsorship. So if you kind of socialize the idea with a senior leader at the beginning, it'll be much easier for you to actually build this out.
Sounds good. And you talked a little bit about some of the initiatives that one of these groups have. So let's say you have a group of people, you have some sponsorship, maybe a little bit of money. You talked about doing some videos, talked about events. Like, describe a little bit about those and then what they would be used for in the context of like the ERG and like the DNI initiatives.
Hmm. Um, you know, Again, like events can range. You can have events that are solely focused, and this is kind of like how I bucket them. The events that are solely focused on culture,
Mm.
and what I mean by culture and engagement. So you can have, for example, again, and we're relating it specifically to DNI. You can have a Foods of the World celebration where it's a potluck and employees bring foods from different cultures. You can have a barbecue, and in that barbecue, you have some kind of message or some kind of game that provides either almost like a fundraiser or provides some kind of educational purpose around DNI, right? So you have these fun engagement events, right? And it could be centered around what your ERG is about. And then you also have storytelling as an event. Or a stream. So, in the context of DNI, some of the biggest things is having people, again, especially people in leadership roles, names that people across organization recognize, share their story as it relates to a topic like diversity and inclusion, really helps you get people's attention, get people listening, and start again reinforcing that culture of learning, acceptance, and reinforcing those DNI messages that you're trying to spread, right? So storytelling, from my experience, in any topic that you're trying to get out, really grabs people's attention. People like to know about other people, and people like to hear people in leadership share more personal stories, being open, authentic, and vulnerable. It really catches people's attention. So that's something that we've done in the past, has been super successful, and I've seen other ERGs do that as well. Not necessarily for DNI, just for other topics as well. So that's another kind of bucket, the storytelling, and it could be through a social media post, it could be through an interview, a podcast, whatever the case is. And then you have really kind of like the education piece, and that could be done through various things, right? It could be done through providing people with reading lists or recommended articles, social media posts on training options, or books to read. And then you can also, depending on how large or how many resources you have, is almost have a trainer the approach, right? So for example, in DNI, if you want to start having difficult conversations and you want people to start understanding, learning their unconscious bias, it's almost that trainer approach, leveraging your team on the ERG to get trained by an expert or a specialist in DNI, right? And they might only have 3 specialists, but your team has 11 or 12 people. They've all got trained, and they can take that throughout the organization and spread that message and help, you know, help have these courageous conversations, help train people. And unfortunately, a lot of times you'll find the DNI team, for example, a little bit smaller in companies, right?
Mm.
So it's going to be hard for them to get to all of the frontline leadership. And that's where I see ERGs, DNI ERGs really supporting.
That's amazing. So what I took from that is some of the initiatives are really fall under kind of two large buckets in terms of like education and entertainment. So the education is kind of that awareness, the storytelling, the training, the getting people really aware of all of these different things that are there. And then there's an entertainment value where like food and barbecues and then networking
Yeah.
and connections. That's always the good part because you don't always want to be bogged down by just kind of like all the serious stuff. There's some amazing fun stuff that happens with all of these as well when you get to learn other people, all the other cultures, sampling all the different foods. I would love to do
Exactly.
that. And
Exactly.
yeah, I think that would be amazing.
It just helps reinforce the culture. That engagement, it's fun, but it still drives a purpose, which is that culture reinforcement. So
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit on having those kind of difficult conversations and approaching really that unconscious bias, right? So for those that aren't familiar with that, like, can you describe a little bit of that? Maybe some examples of how it might have been encountered in your work, and how do we start being more aware and more conscious of our biases so that we're not stuck on that other side of the difficult conversation?
for sure. Um, you know, Recognizing your unconscious bias and that self-awareness and reflection is huge because it'll also impact other areas in your efforts to have a more diverse and inclusive organization, like microaggressions that happen, right? Or understanding how people identify and intersectionality. So just unconscious bias, I like that as the first step. This is
Mhm.
kind of your building block to your D&I learning journey. And there's actually an implicit unconscious bias test through Harvard online. I believe it's free that you can take,
Okay.
and you can and it's a series of tests, and it basically shows you where your unconscious bias is, right? And that, I think, is the most important thing for you to do, is to take a test and understand where that lies, so you're at least aware um, of where your blind spots are, right? And you can at that point go into, whether it be an interview, meeting new people, promoting or hiring, uh, key things that you really need to make sure that that you're not having any kind of bias. You can go in with a little bit more of heightened awareness, and you can ask yourself and you can question yourself, or you can take measures to make sure that your decisions aren't influenced by your unconscious bias, by understanding what they are, and maybe having a more diverse interview panel with you, right? If you recognize, for example, that you might have unconscious bias to women for whatever reason, or to married individuals. So examples like that help you either navigate through that with strategies, or help you really question yourself before you make a decision and slow your decision making down. Some of the things that we're doing as an organization, and I think it's a great step, is, like I mentioned, Luki, taking that unconscious bias test to understand where those are, and taking a quiz and a little bit of an educational process to understand what it means. What are some different types of unconscious bias, like recency bias, the halo effect, some of them, the more common ones? How do you identify them? How do you take a step back and say, am I making this decision because of the person's merits, or am I making this decision because the person just recently, did something that's fantastic, but the rest of the year hasn't been that great, right? So just an example. And then another thing that we're also doing is we're getting into conversations for people to openly express their unconscious bias, and for them to share it with their peers, so that their peers are able to go back and give them feedback on whether or not they've experienced the same thing, how they would recommend that they would manage that unconscious bias. And having that dialogue might make things also a little bit more easy for people when they're going into managing and actually influencing that behavioral change.
That's awesome. So what I took from that is it's really that awareness piece because a lot of us don't know
Mhm.
what we don't know, right? So sometimes to have someone point out our blind spots and recognize that, oh, I didn't even realize that because like no one really goes around saying, hey, I'm intentionally racist, but that's kind
Exactly.
of the part of the unconscious part that's a little bit insidious in the sense that, well, you don't even know, right? And it's not that you're doing it to be malicious or anything. It's just like,
No.
oh, because of your experience, you were raised in a certain way, so you assume that everybody's like that. But unfortunately, that's not true because the world is so different. Um, And yeah, I think taking that test, I'll probably need to go find one and make sure that I'm covered or at least aware, and then start taking action to say, okay, yeah, I need to uh, accommodate for areas where I feel a little less comfortable in that. So you
Yeah.
mentioned like microaggressions a few times. Can you define or give us an example of a couple of those so that we could potentially be aware of whether or not we are making any of these microaggressions or?
Yeah, for sure. I think of it, and I'm not like, I know I've done a lot of DNI work and I'm passionate, but like, I'm just a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in
Sure.
DNI, and this is not my full-time role. So if I get something wrong, I apologize. And I welcome feedback on how to learn. I'm still on my own learning journey. But to me, a microaggression sometimes I feel almost happens, or I believe, sorry, it happens at a subconscious level. And it's small actions that aren't blatantly racist, that might not be meant to exclude. It may or may not be meant to exclude somebody, but they're so small that they can go unnoticed.
Mhm.
But they still, in an underlining way, make that person feel bad, or make them feel excluded, or even can result in that individual's disengagement. And to me, in my own personal experience, it's almost like a death by a thousand cuts, right?
Mm.
Like, if you have and you've gone through many microaggressions, it can really add up, and it can really fester, and be just as bad as if something huge happened one time. Right. So that's my own personal experience, and my own understanding right now of it as well.
Interesting. So I had a conversation with someone recently where we have to be sensitive to everyone's kind of personal kind of situations and perspective and things like that. So the conversation turned into, well, you have to be careful of the examples that you use, because we were talking about leadership and I was talking about charisma, and apparently former US President like Bill Clinton was an example I used because apparently he exudes kind of charisma, right? He makes you feel present in that. But he said, well, you can't actually use him as an example just because, in case anybody leans more Republican than Democrat, right? Because by just using him as an example, you're already putting some sort of kind of reference towards that maybe you support him. So I don't know if that's considered a
In a
microaggression.
way, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because that could be taken, from my understanding, as somebody, like, it's almost like in a unconscious way, you just told, like, people that may be Republican that
Right.
they might not be the best leaders for whatever reason, or they might not have as much charisma or be widely accepted, right?
And if someone was to try to navigate around that, then how could they do it? So obviously you try not to pick anyone who is blatantly either one way or the other, right? So maybe Bill Clinton is not the best one. Maybe it's more someone who's charismatic. I'm trying to think of maybe like a Mahatma Gandhi or something, where I have no idea what his political leanings were, but he was presumably charismatic. I think he was, at least. So just
Yeah.
just choosing the examples. But is there another part of the conversation too? And this is just more me being inquisitive in that, well, sometimes like you can't um, anticipate necessarily how everyone's gonna take something, right? Because the intention was not at all to kind of say I'm pro Democrat or Republican or
Yeah.
whatever. That was not the intention at all. It was just citing example. But like how much of it, or do we put on the kind of receivers and the listeners to say, like, because I have no idea how anybody can take it, so I might not be able to say anything, or I can never use an example, right? So what are kind of like the different areas where I have to just be like mindful of how other people can take it? I'm not sure if I'm asking the question correctly, but
I mean, as it relates to microaggressions specifically, like, in the way I interpret it, or the way I focus on it, is more so, dealings between one person to another, right?
okay.
Like, how different, a boss or a people leader will say something to this individual versus this individual, right?
Hmm.
And is that consistent, or I'll give you an example of what I think is really a microaggression to focus on. Is, if you're in a room with all of these colleagues, and you're a female, and they ask you to take the meeting notes, even though you're their peer. Like that could be a microaggression. Like, and it could be because that's the bias towards females to take on household, corporate duties, right? If you're giving an example, Luki, I don't, it's really difficult because everybody has different perspectives.
Right.
I would say if you are talking about, what it means to be a good leader, focus on the characteristics a little bit more,
Sure.
right? Like focus on the characteristics, because those characteristics, anybody could be anybody, right? Anybody could look like a leader and exude the core competencies that are needed for successful leadership. So that's how I would manage it, or like focusing on your specific example, that's how I would have managed that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's fair, but at the same time, when you instantiate it with a person or very specific, it makes it a lot more real for folks versus kind of the generalities of the characteristics. So I guess it's just a little bit of more work that I have to do to kind of balance. And for any specific things, I have to just kind of take that lens to say, okay, who could I be committing a microaggression against, because I like by no intention, but other people can perceive how they however they perceive it. But I just have to be aware of that. So I think I heard something important in terms of like it's the consistency that's important, right? Because if you behave consistently to everyone, that's good, right? In the sense that I'm not treating anyone any different. But if it's I treat you different than someone else versus someone else, then that's when definitely these microaggressions can kind of rear their head. So as long as it's kind of across the board, it's probably less likely to be a microaggression, although it could always be perceived as one, versus if it's in a particular case. So um, can you describe a little bit about, and we talked a little bit off air about like allyship, like
Sure.
what can be done in that regard?
Yeah. When I think about allyship, and a lot of people have asked, like, what does that really mean? Somebody that doesn't identify as a visible or underrepresented minority, but wants to support and wants to help and wants to come into the D&I conversation from a place of learning, and also somebody that advocates for underrepresented groups and uses that privilege that they have to, like I said, advocate, to elevate, to support, and to maybe provide some opportunities to people that are disadvantaged and might not get those opportunities. So that's what I really think. And like in my view, that's what an ally is. And there's a lot of ways to start that allyship journey. And I've had conversations with a lot of people, and it's almost like this hesitation, like why do I like how am I going to get accepted in this conversation? I don't know anything, and do I even have a right to be in this conversation? And I always say, if you are interested in being an ally, just come from a place of learning. And learning and openness and sharing that vulnerability, I think is the first step to becoming a good ally.
I think that's amazing. So if you want to be part of the conversation, but you don't identify in any of those groups, then just coming from a place of learning, coming from a place of
Exactly.
curiosity, and just kind of say, well, I want to learn. Like, teach me. Like, tell me more. What are some of the things that I am unconscious about, or the things that I have maybe never experienced in my life, and then just seeing, oh, okay, I do realize how that could be pervasive in someone else's life that I would never have gone through, or like whoever the potential ally is here. So can you describe a few of the kind of initiatives that you've been working on, and what are the ones that are kind of like the most effective, or maybe some of the ones even that are not as effective, if you're okay in sharing some of those ones. But like what are the ones, or maybe some of the trends in like the D&I world that could really help kind of elevate the conversations, or bring more awareness to all these conversations?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk in a more general sense on what I've seen uh, is effective and what I see might not be as effective, and that's not only from my experience in my own organization. It's in discussions with some of my colleagues in other companies as well, and just reading on what some of the other companies are doing in D&I.
Sure.
So I think that what can get really ineffective is over communication. And
Okay.
because D&I is such for a lot of people it's a new topic. And I don't mean that people don't know what diversity and inclusion is. I mean like people really have a lot to learn about how they can roll that out in the company, what their gaps are. There's a lot of learning for people. And sometimes when companies want to roll out any kind of D&I initiative, there's so much content and there's so much information. It's your company strategy, your representation goals, your changes to your hiring process, for example. What are all of these definitions? What are the groups in the company that so many things. So it's almost like, have a way to piecemeal it, or roll it out in a more condensed version, because over information is just as bad as like no information.
Right.
So that's what I've seen not be effective. Some of the biggest things that I have seen are effective is mandating D&I initiatives as it relates to a person's goals in the organization, right? Making it a priority for each and every single individual employee to have their own goal in D&I and contribute, and not be almost like a far off topic or a far off strategy that doesn't actually really touch me in any way or impact me in any way, but I'm interested to learn more, right? So it's that shift on the level of importance you put on it within a company. So and ERGs, leveraging ERGs. I've seen it two ways. I've seen it where there's misalignment and there's a lot of different conflicting messages. And I've seen it when the D&I team or the strategies are working with the ERGs, and it's going really well because there's that alignment and there's those additional resources to support.
Cool. Would you have a kind of a rule of thumb in terms of like when you say over communication? That might be a personal choice too, in terms of like for one person it might be like, well, that's way too much. For another person it might be like way too little. Is there kind of a rule of thumb? I don't know if you have the answer to like how much is too much and how much is too little, because it's always that Goldilocks, like the not too hot, not too cold. That can be a little bit challenging because it can be a little bit personal. But is there some sort of guidelines or principles that one could look to kind of help put us in the right direction? Or I'm not sure if you can even answer that, but
It's tough because it is by preference. I would say that, just have the spark notes and have the main key points right at the beginning of whatever email or whatever document you're creating, because whoever's interested in reading more will read more, but people who don't have the time or want to get to it later won't actually ever get to it later. So at least you would have delivered those key concepts.
awesome. And I liked how in the previous point on the effective side, you mentioned that to make it individual in the sense that if it's part of like, yes, the corporate, the company vision and all that sort of stuff, yeah, that's great. But if you make it part of an individual's goals, well, they're a lot more motivated because they should all align together, right? And that's probably
Exactly.
true with anything, not just from a D&I perspective, but whatever you want to make sure people do, they should probably be measured in that regard. So are there any kind of trends from the D&I world that you've seen kind of up and coming? And I'm not sure what those might be, but is there anything that you've kind of seen coming up more frequently or less frequently?
I wouldn't really say it's a new trend within DNI. I think DNI as a topic of learning and conversation is coming up more often. And I'm happy to see that happen because it's been quiet for a while, and there hasn't been as many talk. So it's not so much as from what I'm saying, like a trend or a new concept within DNI. I think the concept itself and getting a little bit deeper in the learning and the understanding is happening a lot more. So that's what I see, and I think it's fantastic.
That's great. So what could we do as individuals, either as employees or maybe even as personal folks to get more involved? So part of what I heard in the discussion is just be a little bit curious. So maybe go
Yeah.
online, do some of these assessments and things like that, and find ways to learn a little bit more. Probably have conversations with coworkers, with leaders, with other folks. Those seem to be kind of the initial starting points. But what are some other things that we could do? Is there like something that I can do tomorrow that would really start moving the needle just a little bit more?
Yeah. You kind of hit them all, Luki. It's really like start learning, start getting curious, reach out to people, look at whether it's at work or at school, a membership or a club that you can that you can join. But if you're asking what you can do like today or tomorrow, it's just slow down your thinking and start to self-reflect and ask yourself certain questions before you make decisions. If you feel like there's some unconscious bias there, slowing down your thinking is what I'd say.
That's amazing. So yeah, I think taking that time to pause and reflect, slow down, and saying like maybe any sort of past interactions that you've had with anybody, could there have been any biases within that conversation? And sometimes again, you don't know what you don't know, so that's why having conversations with others and maybe even having that open and frank to say, hey, do you notice me doing anything that I shouldn't be doing, or I have unconsciously been doing? Or that might be good to get an external opinion as well. Yeah, and I think as these conversations get out in the open a little bit more, then more and more people will recognize it, and then hopefully we'll get a lot more of all those benefits in terms of like engagement and inclusion. And I'm sure when that happens, there's a lot more productivity and safety that's understood in the workplace. And then yeah, that's probably a lot related to profitability and then all that good stuff
For sure.
from the top and the bottom line. Are there any other kind of points in from a D&I perspective that you want to kind of tackle or address? Because I'm still learning, and I would love to know a little bit more if there's other places where I should learn.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many resources that I'm happy to share with you if you want to post it after. But
Yeah.
even if you just go online and just search up or Google like podcasts, if you're not into reading, there's a ton of information out there. But I would start by the Harvard implicit bias test. That's
Okay.
what I would start. Unconscious bias test. That's where I would start off with, really.
That's awesome. So hopefully we'll include a link in the show notes about that, and we'll get more people aware of or conscious of their unconscious bias. And well, thanks so much for engaging in the conversation. And the caveat, I guess, we should have started with is neither of us are experts, so we're just curious and learning. So as Nora mentioned before, if any of us misspoke in any area, then we apologize in advance, and would love to learn a little bit more. So I'm open to any comments as well, because I'm still learning about this interesting topic as well. So thanks, Nora, for engaging in the conversation, and hopefully we'll have you back for another interesting topic.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nora.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Lukidanu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.